A tunnel, 1,305 meters long, carved through solid sandstone at 13 meters below the surface of the Egyptian desert, with a geometric precision so exact that the deviation across its entire length is less than the width of your hand. No modern instruments, no GPS, no laser alignment systems. This is not a Roman aqueduct or a Victorian railway bore. This is a structure built somewhere between the 3rd and 1st century BC, and according to every assumption we have made about the limits of ancient construction, it should not exist. In 2024, archaeologists confirmed what ground-penetrating radar had been quietly suggesting for years. The tunnel beneath the temple complex of Taposiris Magna is real. It is intact, and it leads somewhere no excavation team has yet reached. Egypt Archaeology 2025 is not what the textbooks prepared you for. Ancient engineering, it turns out, operated at a level we are only now beginning to measure correctly. And what follows in the next several minutes will require you to revise more than one thing you thought you knew. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who actually wants to know what they don't teach in school, hit subscribe right now. We go this deep on every single video. Don't lose this channel. Subscribe before the first revelation hits. By minute 10, you'll want the entire series. Between 2024 and 2025, 6 discoveries in Egypt quietly rewrote chapters we thought were settled. A tunnel of impossible geometric precision beneath a Ptolemaic temple. A sunken luxury vessel that matches the written descriptions of a Greek geographer almost word for word, 2,000 years after he wrote them. A stone inscription identified as one of the earliest public civic calendars in recorded history. A network of ancient Nile canals that served as the principal approach routes to Egypt's most sacred sites. A flooded royal tomb showing signs of deliberate reorganization by one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. And a debris mound 23 meters high that may be concealing something no living archaeologist has yet seen. The mysteries of Egypt have not been resolved. They have deepened. Taposiris Magna is where this journey begins. 13 meters underground, in a corridor our models said could not exist. From there, we move to the harbor floor of Alexandria, to a buried calendar in Upper Egypt, to a submerged royal chamber in the Valley of the Kings, and finally to an unexcavated mound still waiting in silence. 6 discoveries, 1 argument. We have been systematically underestimating these people for a very long time. The tunnel beneath Taposiris Magna holds its geometry too, within a few centimeters across more than 1,300 meters of solid sandstone drilled in the dark, without GPS, without laser instruments, sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BC. That is not a reconstruction estimate. That is what the 2024 physical measurements confirm. Consider what that number actually means. Sandstone is not a cooperative material. It fractures along unpredictable planes. It responds differently to pressure and moisture at different depths. To carve a passage through it at 13 meters below the surface and to maintain geometric alignment across more than a kilometer requires a level of surveying precision that most archaeologists, until very recently, were comfortable attributing only to civilizations equipped with precision metal instruments, written engineering manuals, and standardized measurement systems. The Ptolemaic engineers who built this tunnel had none of those things, or so the textbooks suggested. The standard model for ancient tunneling was straightforward. You followed the rock. You corrected as you went. The result was a functional passageway, rough, approximate, useful as a tool, not as a precision instrument. But when Dr. Kathleen Martinez's team, working in collaboration with Egyptian authorities, confirmed the tunnel's geometry using ground-penetrating radar and partial excavation in 2024, the measurements did not fit that model, not even approximately. The deviation across the tunnel's full length is measured in centimeters, not meters. Centimeters, over more than 1,300 meters of subterranean sandstone, carved in the dark, with tools that left no written record of their technique. Imagine placing a ruler across a football field, then extending it through 10 more football fields underground without any electronic reference point, and arriving at the other end with an error smaller than the thickness of your thumbnail. That is the margin Cleopatra's tunnel operates within. In confirmed structural measurement, not in legend, Martinez has argued for more than 2 decades that Cleopatra, the Seventh, and Mark Antony may be interred somewhere within the Taposiris Magna complex, rather than in Alexandria as popular history assumes. The tunnel does not prove this, but it substantially raises the weight of the hypothesis. A kilometer of precision stonework does not get built as a secondary feature of a site. It gets built as an approach to something important enough to justify the extraordinary scale of effort required to reach it. Here is the irony the discovery carries with it. The structure most likely to tell us where Cleopatra is buried is currently preventing excavators from reaching it. Sections of the tunnel have partially collapsed. Others are flooded. The full extent of what lies at the terminus remains sealed by groundwater and stone that has not shifted in 2,000 years. The answer to how they built it? Through extraordinary surveying skill. A system of geometric transfer we have not yet fully reconstructed, and a workforce operating with organized precision that defies the casual label of primitive, raises a question larger than the one it answers. What were they carving toward? What required a kilometer of geometric accuracy just to approach? That question remains open, and the next two discoveries suggest the engineering at Taposiris Magna was not exceptional. It was the standard. In the 2nd century BC, the Greek geographer Strabo traveled through Egypt and recorded what he observed in Alexandria's royal harbor. Among the vessels he described were ships built not for warfare or commerce, but for leisure floating structures with private rooms, decorated interiors, dining spaces designed for formal groups, royal pleasure craft. Historians spent the better part of 2 millennia treating this as rhetorical embellishment, the kind ancient writers occasionally permitted themselves when describing the extravagance of foreign courts. In 2024, that debate effectively ended. Marine archaeologists working in the submerged sections of Alexandria's ancient harbor recovered a wreck at approximately 8 meters of depth, preserved by the low oxygen conditions of the harbor sediment. The vessel is roughly 35 meters in length, comparable to a modest, modern yacht. The whole construction dates to the late Ptolemaic period. But it is the interior evidence that closes the argument. Fragments of mosaic flooring consistent with formal decorative spaces, structural dividers indicating private cabin sections, and galley equipment scaled for passengers expecting extended comfort on the water, not a war crew living in tight quarters. Stop and translate that into physical reality. Strabo was not embellishing. He was writing field notes. The luxury boat Alexandria's harbor held matches his description with a precision that goes well beyond coincidence. And if royal pleasure craft of this scale were common enough for a visiting geographer to record them, without particular astonishment, as one feature among many in a busy harbor, the economic infrastructure required to build and maintain them was substantial. The craftsmen. The imported materials cedar from Lebanon, bronze fittings, decorative elements from Alexandrian workshops, the harbor logistics, and the trained crew. This was not an anomaly in Ptolemaic Egypt. It was an expected feature of royal life, as unremarkable to the people of that era as a private vehicle is to an executive today. Now consider what was found 300 kilometers to the south, in a context entirely different, and yet telling precisely the same story from a different angle. The excavation of the Are Valley Temple complex, the Temple of the Sun Ra, has been producing findings since 2023, with major results published in early 2025. Among the inscribed stones recovered from a secondary structure within the complex, archaeologists identified what is now classified as a public civic calendar, not a private priestly ritual schedule. A public register, listing named festivals, processional events, and designated community gathering days, with associated dates in the Egyptian civil calendar and notation of which groups within the population were expected to participate. Organized civic calendars of this kind, schedules published for a general population rather than an administrative elite, appear in the historical record primarily from classical Greece and the Roman Republic. Finding one in Egypt, in a context that predates those parallels by several generations, forces a genuine recalibration of how we have understood Egyptian civic organization. What kind of society produces a public event calendar? One that expects its citizens to show up. These people were not only building temples, they were scheduling community life around them. On this day, we gather here. On that day, the procession moves along the river. On the 3rd week of this month, the square at the temple entrance will be full. that is not the administrative output of a primitive society managing a captive labor force. That is civil planning. And the Nile, it turns out, was at the center of how all of it was executed. But the most unsettling part is still ahead. Thutmose II ruled Egypt for approximately 3 years, possibly 4. The records are incomplete, which is itself a problem worth pausing on. In a civilization that inscribed administrative accounts on pottery shards and recorded astronomical observations on temple ceilings, a pharaoh's reign leaving behind almost no documentation is not an oversight. It is a signal. The tomb of Thutmose II had been one of the longest-standing missing pieces in the archaeology of the Valley of the Kings. Every other pharaoh of the 18th dynasty had an identified burial site. His remained theoretical, suspected to exist, possible location debated, never confirmed by excavation. In early 2025, an Egyptian-led team working in a previously restricted section of the valley confirmed it. The tomb exists. It has been found, and what it contains is generating more scholarly discussion than almost any Egyptian discovery of the past decade. The primary chamber had been entered in antiquity. The evidence is unambiguous. Funerary objects had been moved. Canopic jars, repositioned. The arrangement of burial goods does not match the standard 18th dynasty protocol that archaeologists can now reconstruct with confidence from dozens of comparable sites. Someone with unrestricted access, institutional authority, and detailed knowledge of proper funerary practice entered this chamber after its initial sealing and reorganized its contents. Carefully, deliberately, not looted. Reorganized, the leading interpretation, now supported by spatial analysis of the chamber layout and early readings of fragmentary inscriptions on the walls, points to Consider what that means. Hatshepsut, the woman who would become one of the most consequential pharaohs in Egyptian history, who ruled for over 2 decades, who commissioned the mortuary temple at Deir el, who sent trading expeditions deep into the territory of Punt, began her ascent as regent following the death of her husband, Thutmose II. And at some point in those early years of regency, the material evidence now suggests she entered his tomb, not to desecrate it. Notes. Tu lut. Italiano. The objects are substantially intact. The chamber shows no markers of ransacking. The reorganization appears careful and considered a deliberate act of representation, a woman reshaping how a dead king would be read by the priests, officials, and successors who came after, perhaps to position her own emerging authority in precise relation to his frozen legacy. This is not speculation. This is the interpretation the recovered material evidence supports, and it is entirely consistent with everything we already know about Hatshepsut's extraordinary political intelligence. What does it mean when the most powerful woman in ancient Egypt enters a sealed royal tomb and leaves everything intact? But beneath the primary chamber, and this is where the discovery becomes genuinely difficult, 2 process excavators encountered a second level. Flooded, sealed by decades of rising groundwater, inaccessible with current equipment. The water table beneath the Valley of the Kings has been climbing for years, a consequence of modern irrigation infrastructure and the altered subsurface hydrology of the Luxor region. What is in the lower chamber, no living person knows. Ground-penetrating radar suggests the space is substantial. Whether it contains additional burial goods, inscriptions that might reshape our understanding of Thutmose II's brief and shadowed reign, or physical evidence of a second deliberate act of reorganization below the one Hatshepsut conducted above. That question is currently sitting in a sealed chamber, underwater, in the dark, in the Valley of the Kings, the most important room in the most contested royal tomb of 2025, has not yet been entered by any human being alive. If what you just learned bothered you good, that means you're paying attention. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because what we're investigating in the next video makes this look like the introduction. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model for how ancient Egyptians accessed their temple complexes was this. They walked. Processions moved across desert terrain, along avenues lined with sphinxes and ceremonial markers, from Nile-adjacent settlements to the temple precincts at the desert edge. The long stone causeways were primary, the approach to the sacred was terrestrial. That model is now being substantially revised. The excavation of the Ra Valley Temple complex produced, alongside the civic calendar, something the team initially classified as a secondary finding: the mapped remnants of a canal system. Not a single canal, a network, running from the Nile's edge toward multiple temple complexes, with constructed stone quays, landing stages, and ceremonial entry points positioned at the water's edge rather than at the temple's desert-facing perimeter. The logistical infrastructure of sacred Egypt, it appears, was primarily aquatic. Those long desert causeways, the ones we assumed were the primary ritual approach, may in many cases have been secondary access routes, used for smaller movements and specific processions. The principal arrival was from the river. Major offerings came by boat. Large priestly processions moved on water. The officials who managed the canal access points were not gatekeepers of a side entrance. They were the gatekeepers of the main one. The labor economics of this are not incidental. Moving heavy stone, large quantities of agricultural offerings, and substantial numbers of people across desert terrain is time-consuming and logistically demanding. Moving the same loads by managed canal, with controlled water flow and purpose-built landing infrastructure, is none of those things. The Nile Logistics Network was not a luxury addition to an otherwise terrestrial system. It was a core engineering decision, motivated by the same underlying logic as the tunnel at Top Osiris: magna efficiency, in service of a system too large and too complex to run inefficiently. Now de Mon, near one of the newly confirmed temple sites in the Valley Complex, ground survey teams have been monitoring a debris accumulation that stands 23 meters high, the equivalent of an 8-story building, constructed entirely from deposited material over a very long period. Not a natural geological feature, a structured accumulation with no satisfying mundane explanation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2024 returned anomalies in the mound's lower sections that archaeologists are now treating with formal seriousness. Regular geometric shapes beneath the surface accumulation, void spaces consistent with sealed interior chambers, and what appears to be an entrance corridor oriented along the standard east-west axis used in royal burial contexts. No excavation team has yet penetrated the mound. The accumulated structure above must be systematically removed before anything below can be safely assessed, a process that, under optimal conditions, will require years. But the profile, the scale, the orientation, the radar signature, the confirmed proximity to a royal temple complex is consistent with an undisturbed royal burial. Not entered in antiquity, not known to any dynasty or survey team that came after the original construction. 6 discoveries, 1 unmistakable pattern. The question is no longer what they built, it is how much more is waiting, and how much longer it will take us to find it. The answer is not a single revelation. It is a convergence of 3 things that happened simultaneously in the early years of this decade. And understanding them matters because it tells us something important about how much still remains. First, the technology changed. Ground-penetrating radar has been used in archaeological surveys for decades, but the instrument available to field teams in 2024 is not the same one that existed in 2004. Advances in signal processing and subsurface imaging resolution now allow excavators to distinguish void spaces, geometric structures, and material boundaries at depths and precision levels that were simply unavailable before. The tunnel at Top Osiris Magna was not invisible to earlier surveys. It was below the resolution threshold of the equipment those surveys employed. How many other tunnels, chambers, and corridors are sitting just below the resolution threshold of yesterday's instruments? Second, the funding returned. The period between roughly 2011 and 2021 was damaging for field archaeology in Egypt. Political instability, pandemic disruption, and the partial withdrawal of major international institutional support reduced active excavation projects significantly across the country. The teams that resumed in 2022 and 2023 carried backlogs of identified but unopened sites, new equipment, and institutional mandates to move deliberately. Much of what was announced in 2024 and 2025 had been slowly accumulating in survey data for years. The discovery cycle is, in meaningful part, a delayed harvest. Third, the permissions changed. Egyptian authorities, under the direction of the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, extended excavation licenses into zones previously restricted, including sections of the Valley of the Kings not formally opened since the 1970s, and the submerged harbor zones of Alexandria requiring marine archaeology certification and extensive governmental coordination to access legally. These three factors explain the timing of the discoveries. They do not explain what the discoveries mean. What they, mean taken together, is this. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization of isolated monuments. It was a civilization of interconnected systems. The tunnel and the canal network were logistics and infrastructure. The civic calendar and the luxury vessel were administration and culture. The flooded royal tomb and the unexcavated mound are memory. The way a society deposits its most consequential decisions into a future it cannot predict or control. Our standard historical models have treated Egyptian achievement as spectacular but narrow, impressive buildings. Elaborate religion, sophisticated death practices. What the 2024 to 2025 discovery cycle reveals is something considerably broader. An administrative infrastructure capable of scheduling community life across a large geographic region, a hydraulic logistics system sophisticated enough to make river-based temple access the default mode of arrival, and an engineering tradition capable of producing geometric precision in the dark, underground, without instruments we have yet fully reconstructed. This is not what primitive looks like. It never was. Here is the argument these 6 discoveries make. Taken together, ancient Egypt did not build wonders in isolation. It built systems, interconnected networks of engineering, civic organization, logistics, and symbolic power, and then buried them. Not deliberately, simply by existing, layer by layer over centuries, until the surface of the present covered the architecture of the past so completely that we mistook the surface for the whole. What does that say about us? It says we have a persistent tendency to set the ceiling of past human achievement just below the level that would require us to revise our own assumptions. We are comfortable with ancient people being spiritual, artistic, and mathematically sophisticated. We are less comfortable with them being administratively complex in ways that look uncomfortably like the present. The mound is still there, 23 meters high. Whatever is sealed inside it has not been touched by any human hand in perhaps 3,000 years. It waits the way that only buried things can wait, without impatience, without urgency, with the quiet indifference of something that has always known it would eventually be found. The question is not what the ancient Egyptians were capable of. The question is how much we are still prepared to learn. History keeps its biggest secrets in plain sight. Subscribe. We know where to look.